For centuries, the world has been shown the same version of ancient Egypt. The towering pharaohs, the golden tombs, the gods carved in stone. But hidden inside private collections, buried excavation archives, and forgotten archaeological vaults, there exist images of ancient Egypt that were never meant to be seen by the public. Images that challenge everything we think we know about one of history's greatest civilizations. This is what they didn't want you to find. Ancient Egypt endured for more than 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded Western history. And yet, what most people know about it could fit on a single museum placard. The Egypt presented to the world has always been the Egypt of power, of divine pharaohs, sacred rituals, and monuments built to last eternity. But beneath that polished surface lived millions of ordinary human beings: farmers, soldiers, healers, criminals, lovers, and rebels. Their stories were carved into obscure tomb walls, painted on papyrus scrolls that were locked away for decades, and captured in archaeological photographs that never made it into textbooks. Through these rare visual records, we can begin to see ancient Egypt as it truly was, not as a myth, but as a world. One of the most powerful images to emerge from modern Egyptian archaeology is a painted relief discovered inside a workers' cemetery near the Giza Plateau, dating back to approximately 2500 BCE. It shows a line of men carrying stone blocks beneath the open sky. Their bodies are lean and worn. One figure leans against another, as though exhausted beyond what the body can reasonably endure. And for generations, the dominant narrative insisted that the pyramids were built by slaves, tens of thousands of captive human beings driven by force and fear. This image quietly dismantled that story. The men buried at Giza were paid laborers. They received daily rations of bread, beer, onions, and fish. They had access to the most advanced medical care in the ancient world. Their bones, excavated alongside the relief, show evidence of healed fractures, proof that someone treated their injuries and kept them alive to work again. These were not nameless victims. They were craftsmen who built the most enduring structures in human history, and their civilization acknowledged it. Among the most suppressed figures in the entire history of ancient Egypt is the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled during the 14th century BCE and came closer than any individual in history to destroying the religious foundations of an entire civilization. What makes Akhenaten visually remarkable is that his physical appearance was recorded with a brutal honesty almost never seen in royal Egyptian art. Surviving carved reliefs, many of them deliberately buried after his death, show a ruler with an elongated skull, narrow eyes, full lips, wide hips, and a swollen abdomen completely at odds with the idealized muscular bodies that Egyptian artists always used for their kings. He dismantled the old gods, erased their names from monuments, and built an entirely new capital city in the desert dedicated to a single solar deity. When he died, his successors responded with one of the most systematic acts of historical erasure in the ancient world. His city was abandoned. His statues were smashed. His name was chiseled off every wall it had been carved into. The images that survived did so only because they were buried too deeply to reach. When archaeologists uncovered them in the early 20th century, they immediately became controversial, not because of what they showed, but because of how violently history had tried to erase them. A painted papyrus discovered in a Theban tomb and dated to the New Kingdom period around 1200 BCE caused immediate discomfort when European scholars first examined it in the 19th century. It depicts a gathering of Egyptian women in an intimate domestic setting, drinking wine, adorned with flowers, meant their expressions relaxed and animated in a way that official temple art never permitted. The image was cataloged, filed away, and rarely discussed in public scholarship for nearly 100 years. What it reveals is that Egyptian women occupied a legal and social position that was, by the standards of virtually any ancient civilization, extraordinary. They could own land and property independently of their husbands. They could initiate divorce and retain their assets afterward. They could testify in court, conduct business, and in some cases hold positions of significant civic authority. This papyrus did not fit the story that Western historians preferred to tell about ancient societies, and so it was quietly sidelined. But it survived. And the women in it are still there, still laughing, still entirely at ease in a world that history forgot to mention. Official Egyptian military art followed one unwavering rule. The pharaoh always won, always dominated, and always appeared larger than every other figures on the wall. Enemies were shown crushed, fleeing, or groveling at the feet of divine power. But a rare painted wooden panel, discovered in a provincial tomb, dated to around 1450 BCE during the height of the New Kingdom Empire, shows something that the Grand Temple reliefs never allowed. An Egyptian soldier standing at the edge of a formation, shield raised not in aggression, but in defense, his body angled sideways, the unmistakable posture of a man deciding whether to hold his ground or run. There are no divine rays of light in this panel, no towering pharaoh, just a young man from somewhere along the Nile, standing on a foreign battlefield, afraid. Military historians consider images like this among the most honest records of ancient warfare ever produced, not because they reveal tactics or strategy, but because they reveal the simple, terrifying human reality that official art was specifically designed to conceal. Hidden among the thousands of papyrus fragments recovered from the ancient workers' village of Deir el-Medina, a community of skilled craftsmen who spent their lives building and decorating royal tombs, archaeologists discovered something completely unexpected: illustrated satirical scrolls depicting animals performing human activities. In one scroll, a lion and a gazelle play a board game with expressions of intense concentration. In another, mice lay siege to a cat fortress using miniature siege ladders, while the cats inside appear to be surrendering. Monkeys play musical instruments. A mouse pharaoh is carried on a litter by mouse servants. These images were created during the Ramesside period, around 1150 BCE, by the same craftsmen who painted solemn religious scenes inside royal tombs by day. The scrolls were never meant for public display. They were private entertainment, possibly dark humor created by workers who spent their entire lives serving a system they were not permitted to openly criticize. Scholars believe the imagery was a coded form of social satire, mocking the excesses of royal court life using animal stand-ins to avoid the consequences of direct ridicule. They represent an Egypt that mainstream history has almost entirely ignored. Witty, irreverent, politically aware, and deeply human. A limestone relief carving discovered at a minor noble's tomb in Middle Egypt shows a scene so ordinary that for decades it was considered archaeologically unimportant. Two children are depicted wrestling in the mud beside a riverbank, arms locked together, faces turned upward in what appears to be laughter. A smaller child nearby reaches toward a duck that is visibly uninterested in being caught. The carving dates to approximately 1800 BCE. It was found in a storage drawer at a regional museum in the mid-20th century, where it had sat largely unexamined for years. Small domestic carvings like this were consistently passed over in favor of royal reliefs and religious iconography, judged to have no significant historical value. But contemporary Egyptologists now recognize them as among the most important records of ancient life, precisely because they show what the grand monuments never showed: the texture of daily existence, the small, irreversible moments of childhood, the laughter beside a river on an afternoon 3,800 years ago. In the ruins of a New Kingdom estate excavated near ancient Thebes, archaeologists uncovered a series of small clay plaques pressed with human faces. They are rough objects. The features are unidealized and individual. Broad noses, heavy brows, mouths set in expressions that range from exhaustion to something resembling defiance. Scholars believe these were identity markers used to track enslaved workers attached to large agricultural and administrative estates during the height of Egyptian imperial power. The ancient Egypt did practice slavery, primarily through military conquest. Prisoners taken during campaigns in Nubia, Libya, Syria, and the Levant were absorbed into the Egyptian labor economy, assigned to estates, temples, and state construction projects. These clay plaques were administrative tools, not art objects, but they are among the only surviving images from ancient Egypt that show the faces of enslaved individuals as distinct human beings rather than anonymous figures in a ceremonial procession. They were rarely placed on public exhibition because they introduced a moral complexity that conflicted with the heroic, luminous image of Egyptian civilization that museums spent the better part of 2 centuries carefully constructing. In 1904, during an excavation in the Valley of the Queens on the west bank of Thebes, a team of archaeologists uncovered a sealed burial chamber that had no entry in any official royal record. Inside, they found the remains of a woman surrounded by objects of considerable quality: alabaster vessels, gilded furniture fragments, and a painted wooden cartouche bearing a name that appeared in no king list, no temple inscription, and no administrative document ever previously catalogued. She had been a queen. She had been important enough to receive a tomb in a royal necropolis, and someone had erased her from every official record that survived. Her identity was never conclusively established. The painted scenes on her tomb walls show her performing religious rituals, receiving offerings, and presiding over ceremonies with the same authority depicted in the tombs of far more famous rulers. She stands there in faded color, calm and regal, in a tomb that history decided she was not supposed to have. Cases like hers appear throughout Egyptian archaeology. Powerful individuals, sometimes women, sometimes political figures on the wrong side of a dynastic conflict, whose existence was systematically removed from the official record and survived only because their tombs were sealed deeply enough to escape the attention of those who wanted them forgotten. Among the most significant and least discussed documents recovered from ancient Egypt is a medical papyrus discovered in the mid-19th century and dated to approximately 1600 BCE, though scholars believe it was copied from an even older source. It contains detailed clinical descriptions of injuries, diseases, and surgical procedures written not in the language of religion or magic, but in the precise, observational language of empirical medicine. It describes the examination of head wounds with a thoroughness that anticipates modern neurological assessment by 3 millennia. It distinguishes between treatable injuries, injuries that might be treated, and injuries beyond treatment, a triage system recognizable to any modern emergency physician. The document was not widely publicized when first studied because it challenged a foundational assumption about ancient medicine, that it was entirely bound up in supernatural belief. The truth, as this manuscript reveals, is far more complex. Egyptian healers worked simultaneously within a religious framework and a rigorously practical one. They observed, they recorded, they operated, and they were honest about failure in a way that the mythological image of divine Egyptian wisdom was never supposed to allow. Official Egyptian art recorded exactly one kind of political reality, the unbroken, divinely ordained power of the pharaoh. But scattered archaeological evidence, administrative papyri, workers' graffiti, and a handful of damaged relief carvings discovered at secondary sites tells the story of a period of genuine civil unrest during the late New Kingdom around 1150 BCE, when a series of weak rulers, economic collapses, and grain shortages pushed the population of the Nile Valley to its limits. Among the most striking of these records is a damaged papyrus document describing a workers' strike at the royal necropolis of Deir el-Medina, one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in human history. The workers, who had not received their grain rations for months, simply stopped working and marched to the gates of the mortuary temple complex demanding payment. They sat down and refused to leave. Officials negotiated with them. Some rations were eventually delivered. The workers returned. The pharaoh's temple reliefs recorded none of this, but a single administrative scribe, writing on a document that was never meant to be a historical record, set down exactly what happened. It survived in a storage jar for 3,000 years, and it tells us that ordinary Egyptians, when pushed far enough, were perfectly willing to stand up, even in the shadow of a civilization built on the premise that the pharaoh was a god. These images, painted on papyrus, pressed into clay, carved onto limestone in the back rooms of minor tombs, and preserved by accident in the desert sand, tell the story of ancient Egypt that the grand monuments were specifically designed to prevent. A story of exhausted workers and laughing children, of afraid soldiers and erased queens, of healers who understood more than they were supposed to, and of ordinary people who went on strike when their grain ran out. History has always been written by those with the power to choose what survives. But the past has a way of leaving traces that those in power never anticipated. Every cracked clay plaque, every satirical scroll, every rough carving of two children wrestling beside a river is a small act of survival. Proof that real human lives existed behind the golden mask that ancient Egypt showed the world. And now, thousands of years later, we are finally beginning to see them. If you found these forgotten images of ancient Egypt as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe. We uncover rare historical records and forgotten stories from civilizations across the ancient world every week. The past is far stranger and far more human than history books have ever been willing to admit.